Okay, I think the waiting room has cleared out now, so we'll go ahead and get started. For those of you who don't know yet, my name's Megan O'Grady. I have taken over Megan Holcomb's position at the Colorado Water Conservation Board. I'm the Senior Climate Adaptation Specialist. And so I will do my best to fill Megan Holcomb's shoes, but undoubtedly there will be a few bumps in the road here, so I appreciate all your patience. Today's agenda, I'm going to go ahead and pull it up for just a second. So you should be, can you see the agenda?
Yep.
Okay, great. So we'll have a report out from the state climatologist, and I believe that is Peter this month, and then NRCS. And then this month we'll have an update on the flood threat bulletin, and then follow up with report outs from water providers and others. So this is the agenda for today. Everybody should have access to it, or I'd be happy to share it out. It's not that exciting, but so I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing the agenda so we can move on. Are there any announcements before I get started? All right, well, hearing none, I'm going to hand it over to Peter. And Peter, I think Kat will grant you sharing access.
All right, thank you, Megan. I just tried and I didn't have it yet, but
okay,
soon.
Actually, Megan, I may need you to do that. I think my
sure.
Okay.
All right, Peter, now you are a co-host, so you should.
Awesome. How does this look?
Yep, looks great. Thanks so much.
All right, yep, thanks. For those who don't know me, my name is Peter and I'm with the Colorado Climate Center at Colorado State University. And I'll be taking you through this month's climate conditions update and seasonal outlook. So for those who are around most of the time, this is, again, nothing new. We'll talk about current climate conditions. We'll look at a little bit of a drought and surface hydrology update, although you'll get a lot more of the hydrology side from NRCS after I'm done talking. And then we'll talk about the seasonal forecast and talk about when we are going to get or not get spring moisture, as the case may be. Kevin may remember last April, I had the gumption to make a bet that Denver would not receive any snowfall in the month of May. That may happen again this year, but I'm not feeling quite so bold, if that tells you anything at all. So we're going to start with one of our favorite quadrant charts, looking at water year through March, temperature and precipitation conditions averaged across the state of Colorado. And then we'll kind of back out how we got to this point. So here on the x-axis, we have accumulated precipitation, and on the y-axis, we have statewide average temperature for the months of October through March. So this now encapsulates the first half of the water year 2022. And when we can see that star for 2022 up in the upper left-hand corner, which is the warm, dry corner. It's the corner that we've been all too familiar with recently. You can also see one of the most similar years to this point is 2012. Take from that what you will, but I will say that with 2012, a lot of the damage was done in the second half of the water year, and there's no guarantee that we're going to repeat 2012. So may not stay, hopefully won't stay on even footing with 2012 throughout the coming spring and summer months. All right, this is a map of temperature rankings for the month of March, and it looks blank. It looks like I forgot to make the map, but this is the map. You'll notice there's a slight shading towards the Wolf Creek Pass area, Archuleta County, that area, showing a little bit warmer than normal conditions, or warmer than, I should say, historically average. So I don't want to conflate average and normal. When we say normal, we're usually talking about the latest 3 full decades, so 1991 through 2020, whereas this is looking at rankings out of the full distribution from 1895 to 2022. So the month of March was historically average throughout the state of Colorado, with almost nothing to show on the cool side and almost nothing, well, nothing to show on the cool side and almost nothing to show on the warm side. Given the fact that conditions have been warming over time and the 91 to 2020 normals are warmer than our historical averages. If you look at the last 30 years, it was a slightly cooler than normal March. And then this is how things look compared to our, again, historical average rankings for the full first half of the water year. And we see a lot of above normal temperatures creep in for October through March of water year 2022, particularly throughout much of western and central Colorado, with conditions leaning more normal on the eastern plains or more towards the historical averages. One thing I'll say here is that this is largely driven by what happened in that November-December timeframe, where we had way off the charts warm conditions. Since the beginning of calendar year 2022, we've actually been a bit on the cool side statewide. Particularly February was on the cooler side, and then January and March weren't particularly warm. They were, if anything, a little bit on the cool side as well. And then if we look at the beginning of April 2022, or at least through the 17th, we've been off to a cooler than normal start throughout the northern half of the state. The southern half, it's a little bit closer to normal, with just a little bit of above normal sneaking in, say down in La Plata County. But overall, cooler than normal conditions have prevailed. As we've had relatively active weather, it's not been particularly wet in a lot of places. It's actually been dry, as I'll talk about more later in a couple slides, but it's certainly been unsettled. We've had relentless windy conditions, and on several occasions, we've had cooler air blow in behind the wind. And just to expand upon some of the windy conditions that we've seen, I'm sure the wind has driven some of you crazy as well as me. This is just a screen grab from a tweet that Russ posted on the Colorado Climate Center page a few days back, showing maximum 3-day wind run, or how much wind in miles has blown past the weather station for a few Colorado Agricultural Meteorological Network stations, or COAGMET network stations, across eastern Colorado. And we have highlighted in red boxes where the beginning of this month was a notable wind event in terms of the record at these COAGMET stations. So it was the second windiest period, 3-day period on record for Kersey, third in Burlington, 7th in Yuma. Plenty of wind run. One thing that you'll notice if you look at some of these numbers overall is, if you look at the dates, it's not abnormal to have our higher winds this time of year. March, April, particularly April, tends to be our windiest season in Colorado. And when these winds come without moisture like they have this year, it can be troubling for our precious water balance, because, as we get more wind, that encourages more evaporation. So just to kind of drive home that point, here's a graphic of the wind speeds and wind gusts in gray from the Fort Collins COAGMET station for the first week of April. And then I just wanted to show from this, the Evaporative Demand Drought Index for early April, or EDDI. And evaporative demand, again, I like to say it's not just driven by temperature, because it wasn't particularly warm. It's also driven by humidity, which was low, cloud cover, which was also fairly non-existent, and wind speeds, which were high. And we see, if we look at eastern Colorado, much above normal evaporative demand in early April, and even potentially record high up in kind of along the Cheyenne Ridge and further to the east as you go east from there. So one question that I felt like addressing just briefly here that gets asked a lot, especially when we go through these windy periods, is it getting windier? This is quite a common question for state climate offices, particularly during windy periods. But the evidence doesn't support the claim. We don't see things getting windier over time necessarily, but it's also worth noting that we don't have as good or consistent of historical evidence to vet those kinds of claims as we do for temperature and precipitation. But future climate models aren't, super bullish on it getting more windy either. In fact, some of the ingredients that lead to more windy weather may decrease with climate change. That's kind of its own talk. I won't go too far down that tangent. Perhaps the most important thing to remember here is that April is our windy season. So this is possible to see, particularly in April, and that La Nina springs actually do tend to be more windy in eastern Colorado than El Nino springs. All right, now let's get into some of the precipitation statistics for the month of March and some other recent months in the water year. This is showing March precipitation ranks for 2022 across the state. Again, a lot of areas that sort of in that historical average. You do see some area in the high country of the Northern Rockies that had a below average March. And then we had a few good moisture events, snowfall events, out on the eastern plains, as well as in southeast Colorado, kind of towards the wet mountains and Sangre de Cristos. So some areas with a wetter than normal March. But if we back out and look at the water year through March, or the first half of the water year, you do see quite a bit of drier than our historical average throughout much of southern Colorado and eastern Colorado. Things shift a little bit wetter as we get more towards northwest Colorado. This is largely owing to a wet period we had around the end of December and the beginning of January that made a big difference in the first half of the water year. Also, October, I believe, in that quadrant of the state was a little bit on the wetter side as well. So still holding on to some of that influence up in northwest Colorado. And then here's what we've had for the month to date in April. And you can see some decent moisture. This tends to be near or a little bit above normal so far for the Northern Rockies in April, from Routt County down to the Elk Range and Pitkin and northern Gunnison County. But the San Juans have been a little bit drier and on the drier side of normal. And then certainly as we extend out onto the eastern plains, once we get into, this is a common sort of precipitation pattern for winter, where we tend to see the moisture stay in the mountains. But really, once we get into April, we want to see more of this moisture extending out onto the eastern plains. April is an important month on the plains as well as the mountains. So to see a number of areas across the eastern plains that have been skunked for the month of April to date with 0, and then a much bigger fraction that has had less than 1/10 of an inch in a month that averages around 2 inches, sometimes a little bit over, a little bit under, depending on your location here. But we're well behind in eastern Colorado for the month of April to date. And as the ag season ramps up and we start to see more planting, we see green up, we see things come alive, that's concerning, because we'd really like another fresh layer of moisture on top of those dry soils. All right, this kind of drives home what I was already talking about. This is a proportion of annual average precipitation expected in the month of April map. And the blue-green areas are areas that you would expect, that where April is part of the wet season is probably the best way to put it. It means if you're shaded in blue-green, that means April is a wetter month on average than just an average month. And if you're in the browns, as is the case down in the extreme southwest end of the state. That means that April is relatively part of the dry season. A couple points to drive home here. It's definitely good to see some of that moisture in the Northern Rockies because April is an important month for the water supply. In some cases in the Northern Rockies, April is the wettest month on average. So we certainly want to see wet conditions in the Northern Rockies in April. That was a big part of what was missing last year with the abysmal runoff that we ended up having. You know, our April 1st snowpack numbers didn't look terrible last year, but we just didn't finish it out to peak season like a normal year. And then we didn't have the moisture to follow up after peak season, which still matters for runoff. And then this slide is admittedly a little bit out of place, but I'm okay with it because it's talking about the month of April. This is a precipitation forecast from an ensemble of weather models for the remainder of the month of April. You see the end date here. It's the morning of May 1st. So this is an ensemble of forecast models through the morning of May 1st. And you can see the precipitation legend at the bottom. And what I wanted to drive home is that, you know, we're looking at a similar pattern continuing for the month of April. It's worth noting the European model extends some of these better moisture totals up towards an inch or a little bit above an inch, further south into the San Juans, and even a bit further south towards, say, the wet mountains and the southern portion of our urban corridor. The European model likes those areas a little bit better. But even these areas that are shaded in, you know, the yellow greens, these aren't great totals for the last 10 to 12 days of April. These are just decent totals. And then throughout much of eastern Colorado and southern Colorado, these are low totals to be sure. So it's likely that April will end up being a dry month for much of the state. Also, if you look at the precipitation pattern throughout much of the rest of the central region here, you see the wet conditions over, you know, Missouri extending into Oklahoma and Kansas, as well as wet conditions to our north. So that tells you that it's going to continue to be an unsettled pattern. So even though we're not getting the moisture here, it doesn't mean we're going to get those nice, calm, warm days where it's just nice to be outside necessarily. I do think we'll see some of that. But we're also not done with the wind is one of the other points I wanted to bring home here. We're going to see more windy conditions throughout the some of the rest of the month of April, including this week, meaning that we're not done with some of these red flag warnings, and we're just not done with some of the irritating, drier, windy conditions. All right, now I'm going to shift gears a little bit and just look at water year-to-date accumulation for some of our key indicator states, or sorry, key indicator weather stations around the state, using these climate regions that Klaus Wolter created as a guide. We'll start with region 1 up with Grand Lake, and then we'll work our way around counterclockwise to region 8 with Boulder and take a look at how water year 2022 stacks up to date. Starting with Grand Lake, you can see that moisture that I mentioned in late December and early January. Grand Lake really recovered early in the water here from an early deficit, but the deficits have grown since with a drier than normal end to winter and start to spring. So here, just to orient you a bit, the black line shows the accumulation to date. The stippled line here shows what we get in an average year, and each of these gray lines that spawns off of the black line shows a trace from the previous year. And the idea here with the gray lines is to give you an idea of the spread that we might see going forward and an indication of the odds of catching up to, say, a normal year. And in the case of Grand Lake, we only have 5 or 6 traces that go back above that normal line. So 71% of average for the water year to date, and it's likely that we will stay below normal precipitation throughout the rest of the water year, just given our historical distribution of where things tend to go from here. Similar story in Steamboat Springs, where we started out decent, fell behind a little bit in November, December, caught up, fell behind again, and here we are with most of our traces not making it back up to that normal line, 70% of average for the water year to date. Grand Junction Walker Field is one of those better bright spots in the state, honestly, if you just look at the water year to date. If you look longer term, it's not necessarily a bright spot because we have long-term, more hydrologic drought across much of Western Colorado, as you'll hear more about in a few slides, as well as more about from NRCS. But a number of these traces do go above the normal line. So projecting things forward, we're in a bit better position in Grand Junction. Montrose, similar story to Grand Lake and Steamboat. Mesa Verde, most of the traces stay below the line. We're at just 75% of average. Once we get over to the San Luis Valley and Eastern Colorado, you start to see what I've talked about a little bit already, that once we shift into spring and then summer, that tends to be the wet time of year for the San Luis Valley, as well as much of Eastern Colorado. So even if you're behind early, once you transition into the wet season where you tend to get bigger moisture events, it's a little bit easier to catch up. Whereas if you fall behind during the relative wet season, like you might have seen in some mountainous locations, it's less likely that you'll catch up once you get into spring and summer. Similar story with Colorado Springs. Again, most of the magic happens in Colorado Springs after April 1st, really April through August. So even though we're well behind at only 48% of average, you see a better probability of making things up just based on the seasonality of precipitation in Colorado. But I do want to point out that if you look from about that last week of March through present date, we're supposed to see things ramp up over this time frame, and we've yet to see that in Colorado Springs. And that's going to be a common theme throughout some of these Eastern Colorado stations. You see the same thing at Walsh, where yeah, you get a little bit better probability of catching up because the wet season is still in front of us, but things are supposed to be ramping up now, and they haven't yet, and it's not necessarily in the forecast. Akron, we're a little bit closer to the normal for the water year to date, but it's worth keeping in mind just how dry Akron was in summer last year. So these numbers don't necessarily give credit to just how dry soils were entering the cold season this year. And so Akron could definitely use another shot or two of really good moisture. And then Boulder, similar theme. This is the time of year we're supposed to see things ramp up, and it just hasn't gotten there yet. All right, and then I'm only going to show one standardized precipitation index slide. This is the 24-month SPI. So we're looking at how precipitation compares to normal over the last 24 months. And this is just to give us one perspective outside the water year and kind of orient ourselves to the longer term drought that still exists throughout much of the state. So again, the warm colors are meant to match the US Drought Monitor drought classifications in terms of percentiles. So if you're looking at yellow or this tan color, you're looking at anywhere from the 10th percentile up to the 30th. And then if you're looking at these red colors, you're looking at below the 5th percentile. So a 2-year precipitation accumulation that's well below normal. So we do have some areas that are in the normal range, such as south of Colorado Springs and the Pueblo area, as well as up into the wet mountains. But most of the state is still in this long-term drought sort of mode. And, you know, top meter soil moisture, it can change more quickly than over a multi-year time scale, but this kind of hammers that home as well, that much of Eastern Colorado is looking at dry soils right now to start the growing season. The reports that we've gotten from folks out east, and we may have more of them today, tend to be that, well, you know, January and February were a little on the wetter side, and they saw some snow. Those are dry months on average, and it may have given the surface layer of soil a little bit of a boost, but the subsoil moisture is still far from adequate. So definitely need another layer of moisture to penetrate down into those dry soils. And then you see a mix out on the west slopes. Part of this is terrain effects, where you may see some areas that are wetter than normal, where maybe there's been a bit earlier than normal snow melt. So it's a bit harder to decipher the west slopes right now. There should be higher resolution maps of this coming soon, coming sometime this summer. So I do want to kind of advertise that. And then one of our favorite indices to look at, particularly from an agricultural drought standpoint, is this Vegetation Drought Response Index, or the VegDry, which is out of season during the winter because it's based on satellite sensed measurements of how green vegetation is as compared to normal. And there are some other things blended in there. Early in the season, it tends to mimic long-term SPIs, or like the 9 or 12-month SPIs. But I tend to trust this more and more as the growing season wears on, because you get more and more satellite overpasses. So it's interesting to note that this is coming back online, but I'd lean more on this for information once we get into, say, June or especially July and August. And then this is the current US Drought Monitor. 100% of Colorado is still under some sort of designation from the US Drought Monitor. Although only 82% or 82.9% of it is officially drought. We have a couple areas that are just shaded as abnormally dry, including the parts of the Northern Rockies and urban corridor, and some of the areas that got the best moisture with that late December, early January push, including the Elk Range and areas like Schofield Pass that did really, really well, just in abnormally dry. And then we do have some areas where extreme and exceptional drought is creeping back into the state, like the southeast corner and southwest corner. This is a look at how things have changed over the last 3 months. Like I said, a lot of the damage was done, either last summer or last fall with the warm, dry conditions. And we have been on the cooler side so far for calendar year 2022, and on the wetter side for January and February in particular. And that helped lead to some improvements east of the Continental Divide. But given what we've seen recently, it's possible that you'll see some of this regress pretty quickly here, unless we get a good shot of moisture. And then this is how things have changed just over the last year. So we are in a little better spot than we were a year ago right now, particularly on the west slopes, where they had a good monsoon season, and then snowpack. The monsoon season, as well as some good fall moisture, led to better antecedent soil conditions or soil moisture conditions entering this snowpack build phase than what we had last year. Still below normal, but much better than last year. And then snowpack's a little bit better than where it was in mid-April last year too. So that does help things. And you see some areas where it's helped things quite a lot. All right, now we're going to move into the seasonal outlook portion of things. And I'm going to start by showing another precipitation proportion of annual average from a current month or from a given month. In this case, it's May, not the current month, the next month, since we're now looking at the outlook. But this is to underscore how important a month May is for eastern Colorado, where we really get into what is considered the wet season in eastern Colorado in May, into the thick of it. And then it's also an important month from a timing standpoint, where you really want a couple good $1 million rains out on the eastern plains to help facilitate the growth of crops and forage lands. Western Colorado May can still be important in terms of the overall runoff we see. It can be important in terms of agriculture, farming and ranching out there as well, but it tends to be more what we got in the winter and earlier spring that matters most. But if you think about years like 95 or 2015, certainly a good wet May can be a game changer out on the west slopes. That is possible, but we're kind of out of the transitioning out of the wet season on the west slopes, particularly in southwest Colorado. So when we look at the coming months, our weather prediction models that show us the day-to-day weather tend to descend into chaos after just about 2 weeks. So when we look at seasonal prediction, we have to look at the slower moving state of the ocean. And what often ends up being important is what you see over the middle of the graphic here in the equatorial Pacific, which is the status of the El Nino Southern Oscillation, or El Nino versus La Nina, and you can see the cooler than normal ocean surface temperatures off of the coast of Ecuador and Peru in South America, extending all the way out through the central Pacific. This is the calling card of La Nina. So La Nina has not let go yet. La Nina tends to lead to more thunderstorm activity over the Western Pacific, more in the Indonesia area, and rising air in that area diverging out from the globe, and then sinking air over the cooler waters of the Eastern Pacific. And that circulation is a strong dominant circulation that has ripple effects all throughout the globe. And we'll talk a little bit about those ripple effects. Here's what we tend to see in North America and how it relates to Colorado. La Nina tends to push the jet stream further north over the Pacific Ocean with a blocking high pressure system, kind of shutting the door to Pacific moisture for the Southwest US. The jet stream can be more intense, which can lead to more cross-barrier or cross-mountain flow during the winter, and can be a boost to the Northern Rockies during the winter. But once we get into spring, we tend to not want to see La Nina, because shutting the door to that Pacific moisture tends to be the effect that wins out. And just to prove that, here is a correlation analysis between the ENSO ONI, or El Nino Southern Oscillation Oceanic Nino Index, and seasonal precipitation across Colorado from 1951 through 2020. Like I said, during winter, sometimes La Nina is a boost for the Northern Rockies. Oh, I should mention the areas that are red are wetter during El Nino. The areas that are blue are wetter during La Nina. But once we get into other seasons, so this is December, January, February, or DJF. Once we get into other seasons like spring in the upper right, summer in the lower left, and fall in the lower right, El Nino basically wins out everywhere. Where during El Nino, we're more likely to have an open door to that Pacific moisture, and we're more likely to get these slow moving low pressure systems that track across the Four Corners, northern New Mexico, and the Oklahoma Panhandle that can bring big doses of moisture in one storm to much of the state. You see more of those during El Nino years. There was one other thing that I wanted to mention based on the sea surface temperatures, and that's that regarding Pacific moisture, these cooler anomalies over the Pacific coast of the US extending down towards Hawaii are not a positive sign either. Those that tends to keep us drier as well, because a lot of our good storms are what we call Pineapple Express events, or where we tend to have a rich corridor of moisture that works its way from roughly the Hawaii area up into the continental US, that rains out over first California and then works its way over the higher terrain of Colorado as well. You tend to see those more when the waters between Hawaii and the West Coast are warmer than normal than you do when it's cooler than normal. So that's also a negative influence on the seasonal outlook. And then just to add to kind of the misery, I guess, here, La Nina was forecasted for a long time to regress to more neutral conditions, or kind of fizzle throughout the spring, as it often does. But it's looking more and more like it's going to hold on, maybe all the way through the fall and winter for a third year. So if we look at March, April, May, almost 100% odds that La Nina sticks around. April, May, June, it's still nearly 90. And then you do see a regression in the probability of La Nina hanging around, but it stays over 50% all the way through next fall. All right, now we're going to get into the outlook maps from the Climate Prediction Center. And I want to apologize for this map because it's a lame map, and I'm going to explain why it's a lame map. It's because it's a map for the April outlook that was issued in March, and we're almost 2/3 of the way through April. Why am I showing you an April outlook map? Well, it's because The Climate Prediction Center releases their new maps the third Thursday of the month. And in this month, the third Thursday is as late as it can possibly be. It's the 21st, or 2 days from now. So if you want an update on these 2 days from now, please do reach out and we can chat. Also, I'll be on a call later today where I'll kind of get a sense of what they're thinking for the next Outlook and some of the main influences driving the next Outlook maps. But we're stuck with what we've got, and the April Outlook map, we can see that the CPC, or Climate Prediction Center, went with an increased tilt towards warmer than normal temperatures for the month of April and an increased tilt towards below normal precipitation. Now that we're almost 2/3 of the way through the month, we can kind of adjust those based on what we've seen. We're cooler than normal for the month of April, and the next 10 to 12 days, it looks like we will be tilted more on the warmer side of things, but there will be some cool influence in there as well. So I don't think that's gonna overpower what we've seen in the first half of the month. So it's likely we'll end up more near normal to slightly cooler than normal. And then for precipitation, they went with increased tilt of below normal precipitation, certainly for southern Colorado. I would increase this tilt even further based on what we've seen, particularly for southern Colorado and especially for eastern Colorado, where there are areas in the northeastern part of the state that they gave equal chances entering the month, but have been skunked for the month to date. Now, as we get into the April through June outlook, or the full 3-month period from April 1st through June 30th, things get more interesting because 5/6 of this time period is still in front of us. And once we get into April, May, June, particularly June and the summer period, these increased tilts towards above normal temperatures are largely based on trend. They're based on the fact that Colorado is warming along with much of the rest of the globe, and that we see that most consistently in summer because summer tends to have the least interannual temperature variability. And the last summer that we saw that was below the 20th century average in terms of summer temperature was 2009. So certainly this tilt makes a lot of sense as we get further into summer. And then an increased tilt towards below normal precipitation. I agree with this based on everything we discussed with La Nina, as well as discussion about what's going on off of the Pacific coast, kind of towards Hawaii as well. I think that, while none of this is really a guarantee, these are transient ripple effects that El Nino or La Nina has on atmospheric patterns in the northern hemisphere. And certainly things can happen that would bring back wetter than normal conditions, but it's kind of like playing a game of poker with a couple aces and a couple kings missing, where, yeah, you can still get a good hand, but it's just less likely. And so I do agree with this increased tilt towards below normal precipitation. And, based on what we've seen already in April and potential for land atmosphere feedbacks, I might even extend it across this more heavily increased tilt across more of the state. So I have a note about land atmosphere feedbacks on this slide. This is looking at the May through July outlook, where we can see that tilt towards above normal temperature persists and below normal precipitation largely persists. So once you get into summer season, if you have drier than normal soils, once that hot summer sun beats down on your land surface, you have less water to evaporate and transpire through your plant root systems, which in turn leaves you with drier surface air. Drier surface air makes it harder to generate thunderstorms and in turn keeps precipitation lower. So this land atmosphere feedback, it's kind of like that Newton's second law of an object in motion tends to stay in motion and an object at rest tends to stay at rest unless acted upon by an outside force, or in this case, acted upon by an outside wetter area. And you might be thinking, Peter, that happens all the time. Doesn't most of our moisture ultimately come from the oceans? You would be correct in that. However, given the ocean surface temperature pattern that we saw earlier on earlier slides, we're less likely to be acted upon by that outside force. So a couple things working against us as we go into summer. You do notice, you may notice that this equal chances pack pops back up for the Southwest US, including a corner of Colorado. That's as we get into July, we get into monsoon season, and monsoon season is still very much a toss-up. So tune into later WATFs to see where that might go. But for now, the late spring and early summer, the deck's sort of stacked against us. I skipped the drought outlook. There's not much to say there. CPC is estimating, based on everything that we talked about, that drought is likely to persist across the state. And then I'm not going to belabor this point either. This is percent of normal peak snowpack at snowtel stations across western and central Colorado. You'll hear more about this from NRCS, but just wanted to drive home that not a drought buster winter and spring that we've had. A little bit better than what we saw last year and better antecedent conditions, but far from a drought buster. And then as we get into June, we see that the threat of significant wildfire is elevated across much of our state. As that snowpack melts, the threat for wildfires, the wildfires that we've been seeing across the plains and foothills, extends into the high country, where we tend to see larger burns when fires do happen. So this is definitely something that we're going to be keeping an eye on going forward. All right, so that's all I've got for you. Just some key takeaways, other than the fact that maybe Peter is a little bit bitter. We have that conditions were mixed for March, with a cooler and wetter side of normal early in the month, warmer and drier side later in the month, but overall it was a pretty average March. Long-term conditions are still well on the dry side of normal. This is reflected in soils as well as surface water. You'll get more about the surface water in the next presentation. What happens over the next 4 to 6 weeks is crucial for our water supply, not just in terms of runoff, but also in terms of getting some good soil moisture for our agricultural areas out on the Eastern Plains. We really want to see this turn around sometime in late April or May. And then La Nina is not letting go, which influences our odds of things turning around, not for the better. And it may stick around for a third year based on where models are leaning now. And this reduces our chances of meaningful drought recovery this spring or summer. Again, this drought recovery can happen. My sincere hope is that in 8 weeks, you're looking at tall green grasses and high rivers and thinking about what an idiot I am. But right now the deck is stacked against us. And then our summers are getting hotter. Currently, the seasonal forecast is largely a reflection of this, as well as a reflection of where we're at in terms of La Nina and land atmosphere feedbacks. The coming season is likely to bring above normal fire risks, as well as lower than normal water storage for Western Colorado and beyond. So again, that's all I have for you. I'm going to stop my screen share, but I'm certainly glad to field any questions that folks might have.
Great. Thank you, Peter, so much for that very depressing outlook. Does anybody have any questions for Peter? Feel free to throw them in the chat as well. All right, not hearing any questions. I agree with Kevin's comment. Yeah, Peter, really appreciate your clear presentation of the data. We will all have to do our rain dances.
Yeah.
Okay, then I'm going to hand it over now to NRCS. And I believe Carl that will be doing the presentation.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. I think you need to allow me to be a host, maybe.
Yes, I do.
Share.
Yep, thanks for coming off mute. It brought your name to the top of the list. I was trying to find you there. Okay, you should have sharing capabilities now.
Okay.
Okay.
You guys see that?
Yes, we can. Thank you so much. Take it away.
All right, let's see if it wants to go to full screen. There we go. Okay, yeah. Thanks, Megan and Peter and everyone for joining. Looks like we've got pretty good attendance this month. But yeah, per usual, I'm gonna just kind of go around through our major basins, take a look at both what is currently going on in the mountains, as well as our water supply outlooks, and tie that in with current reservoir storages and a few other things to kind of get a big picture of our total surface water supply situation. As I get started, I will say, even though that a lot of the information, as was just commented on, isn't the most uplifting, when it comes down to the actual water supply forecasts, we certainly are looking substantially better than the last couple years ended up being. So definitely, as Peter said, not a drought buster by any means, but better than what we've been looking at so far, and hopefully those most recent multi-month climate outlooks turn out a little cooler and wetter than anticipated to keep the rivers flowing as long as we can. So as for anyone who was on last month, you'll probably notice there's been on our website, we're starting to transition more and more to utilizing these automated products, both these interactive charts that you'll see, as well as the interactive map and others. So we'll be kind of continuing to tweak exactly all the types of charts, of maps, and everything we're presenting. But yeah, I'll just dive right into Northwest Colorado and the combined Yampa White and Little Snake basins. I'll just touch base on a few big picture things before I dive in to all the numbers through the basins. It's definitely been an interesting last month or so in the mountains. The actual peak will vary basin to basin, but we really, across all major basins, did start to see this net melt during the last week in March there. And we have seen some stream flow responses from that, as well as increases in soil moisture. For instance, here in these basins of Northwest Colorado, recent accumulations have caused a second peak here. But the big picture take home to keep in mind is once we see net melt out of the snowpack there, that basically indicates that it's what we call ripe, which means that it is ready to melt. Basically, it's all at 0 degrees Celsius. And even with colder weather and accumulations, which have maintained near peak values for a longer period of time, with any warmer temperatures, all of these snowpacks are ready to go. So currently here in these basins in Northwest Colorado, we are at 91% of the median. I'll kind of refer to the median as the normal in a general term, but that is the statistical measure we're looking at for most of these parameters. Looking at our water year to date precipitation, certainly a little bit better, largely due to October precipitation last fall, but generally near normal water year precipitation at 96% of the normal. One thing I added in, a lot of our historic products have lumped in the North Platte and the Laramie basins with the Yampa White Little Snake, but kind of good to separate those out because they most certainly flow in very different directions. But pretty good snowpack, one of the better in the state, just as it exits up to Wyoming, unfortunately, at 98% of the median. Very, very similar water year-to-date precipitation, slightly higher there at 101% of the median. And again, just real quick, I'll touch base on some of the bigger picture patterns. Really, a lot of our snowpack and water year precipitation so far was driven by this kind of late December, mid to late December, and then through the new year. Really got a lot of our accumulation in there and then dried out, and some kind of really variable increases across the state when we're looking at basically the last month and a half or a little bit more. Looking at reservoirs, currently every basin in the state has below normal reservoir storage other than the South Platte. So here up in the Yampa, which doesn't have a ton of storage, you see Stagecoach is near normal, which is pretty good. All the other ones ranging from about 55% up to that near 100%. Going into our Streamflow forecasts, so These charts can kind of be a lot to look at. I also have a map coming up here, but the big thing in all of our newer forecast charts to pay attention to is this vertical gray line represents the normal value, 100% of median. Then these colored bars are kind of the range, the statistical range of possibilities. And this darkest bar in the middle is the bold, with the bold numbers, is our 50% chance of exceedance. But you can think of that as the most likely value given normal climatic conditions over the coming months. But you can see generally below normal forecasts across the Yampa White and North Platte. So I didn't put the North Platte in here, but North Platte at Northgate as it leaves the state was one of the better in the state, but you can see coming through Steamboat, 77%. The Elk River puts in quite a bit of water to the main stem Yampa is at 88%. And then very similar downstream, the Yampa at Maybell, one of the major points there, is forecasted for 86% of normal seasonal stream flow volume. Going down south a little bit into the Colorado River Basin, currently snowpack sits right at 99% of the normal value. Again, you can see that brief melt there at the end of March, and then kind of maintaining with some intermittent colder weathers, intermittent snow accumulations, but sitting right near normal as we're very likely going to go into the main melt out season. Water year-to-date precipitation has the exact same value at 99% of. Looking at reservoirs, again, apologies, this is a newer product, and it's not showing all of the major reservoirs in the Colorado headwaters. I'll have to figure that out in general and for next month. But you know, for folks on the Front Range in the Denver area, obviously Dillon Reservoir is a pretty big one for Denver metro area water supply. Looks to be at near 90% of normal there. Willow Creek Reservoir has the only above normal values, probably about between 105 and 110%. Going into Streamflow forecasts, pretty similar to the combined Yampa and White basins. Here with most of our forecasts, the most likely values definitely being well below normal. And again, the different numbers on here, these are representing thousands of acre feet that would be forecasted from April through July, so through that 4-month period. And this furthest number in the right is basically indicating that there's only a 10% chance of achieving this much stream flow volume. So you can see most of those forecast points really only have that 10% chance of exceedance to the right of the normal line. So definitely more than likely looking at well below normal stream flows, and particularly if the multi-month climatic outlook that Peter showed holds true. Looking at a map, not too many big picture spatial patterns here. Certainly some of the more plentiful stream flows are in the Roaring Fork. Here we've got the Roaring Fork at Glenwood Springs at 95% of normal. Rudeye Reservoir inflow on the Frying Pan at 93% of normal. Then kind of leaving the state, what's going to affect downstream users and interstate water compacts and such, obviously amongst many other things, but the Colorado at Cameo as it approaches Grand Junction is forecast for 87%. Moving on over into the South Platte River Basin. Snowpack, again, very similar pattern throughout the accumulation season as we've shown in a lot of basins, but has definitely benefited much more substantially than southern Colorado throughout April here. As you can see, that brief period of melt at the end of March, and then some steady increases still working towards its final peak for the season. Water year precipitation, as one would expect, is following that quite closely at 96% of normal to date, just slightly higher, again, largely due to these increases during October, during the first month of the current water year. Looking at reservoirs, again, South Platte is the only basin in the state with above average reservoir storage. I believe the total is 105% of average currently, with some standouts here. Gross Reservoir supplying Boulder water looks to have some of the highest, but largely pretty well clustered near to above 80% of average. So not a ton of major outliers in the South Platte, which is encouraging to see. Apologies, looks like this image didn't transfer well, but looking at the water supply forecasts, again, here's our gray normal line here with all of our range of possibilities to be much to the left. And as we'll see on the map within the South Platte Basin, it's highly variable with forecasts for the main stem South Platte headwaters coming out of South Park are definitely the lowest, and then generally becoming more plentiful as you move further north, which we'll see in this next slide. So this is basically more of the northern front range flowing east out into the plains here, getting more and more near normal. You can see basically from Boulder Creek, St. Vrain, north on up to the Pooter. Some of these most likely values are 50% chance of exceedance is getting nearer and nearer, in some cases over that 100% of the median line. So looking at that spatially, again, some pretty dramatic differences here with all of the forecasts coming out of the South Park area, and generally just increasing the further and further north you go to these kind of east-west oriented tributaries here from basically from Clear Creek on and north. Moving down into the Gunnison River Basin, which out of anywhere in the state, I would say has one of the more interesting water supply situations this year. Definitely fared rather well with Snowpack in the big picture, currently resides right at 101% of normal. And one other just quick plug I feel like it's very important to throw out this time of year is that these percent of normal values can be rather jumpy, variable day to day, week to week during the melt season, and particularly as we move into lower and lower amounts of snowpack. Those percentages do just get jumpy. So over the next couple months, something definitely to keep an eye on. If you see something that all of a sudden displays 500% of normal, it's worth looking at the graphs and seeing where that lies compared to other years. And, once you get down to the normal being, 2 to 3 inches of snow water equivalent, those values could be rather exaggerated, but had a good peak quite a bit earlier, about 2 to 3 weeks earlier than normal, been maintaining, but pretty near normal snowpack in the Gusts. Very, very similar there with water year precipitation. Again, fared very well, as did the whole state through the end of December into January, and dried out a bit, and then some steady increases there. Reservoir conditions in the Gunnison, I believe, are currently the lowest in the state, looking at the total volume stored in all reservoirs. And I'll have a little bit more wrap up on this, looking at our statewide summary. But since it affects Blue Mesa the most, I will touch base. You can see Blue Mesa is our biggest reservoir in the state. It can hold over 800,000 acre feet. And it is definitely in range of some of the lowest values on record, really going back to when it first built. Maybe mistaken, I want to say in the 1960s, but it currently is sitting at just above 40% of average storage. And that is due to some greater issues in the Colorado River Basin with having to lower basically release water from many of the bigger upstream reservoirs, being Flaming Gorge, Blue Mesa here in Colorado, and Navajo Reservoir to help maintain the power production pool at Lake Powell, which is also at extremely low levels right now. And I guess just to follow up on that real quick, sorry. What I was saying is it's a very interesting water supply situation in the Gunnison, is because it does have one of the better snowpacks in the state, but it also has the lowest reservoir storages. And those do represent a very large volume of water as well. So just because there's a near normal snowpack, it's always worth keeping in mind the impact of those reservoir storages on actual water availability. Looking at our forecasts here, kind of a mixed bag. Some of the smaller tributaries, and I believe I've got another slide here, have lower values, but the Taylor, there's look to be forecast above normal. Gunnison at Blue Mesa Dam is obviously an extremely important point. This 50% chance of exceedance is slightly below normal at 555,000 acre feet. And again, just as a reference, the Blue Mesa can hold over 800,000, and with where it's sitting now, you know, if every drop of that water were to be retained in the reservoir, it may be getting very near full. But we're definitely looking at a long journey to replenish a lot of our bigger reservoirs, both here in Colorado, as well as the entire Colorado River Basin going on out west. I'll skip some of these smaller ones, but to the North Fork, Gunnison is above forecast for above normal, which is good. Down into the Uncompahgre is some of the lower values, unfortunately. I believe Ridgway Reservoir is doing a little better than Blue Mesa, but not great. But currently forecast, this again is acre feet, but it is also forecast near 75% of average. And then kind of the major basin outlet here, the Gunnison at Grand Junction, just above 90% of average volume. So looking spatially, again, you can kind of see some of the more plentiful forecasts up here in the main stem headwaters and generally around the northern boundary of the Gunnison Basin, and generally lower forecasts further to the south. On down to southwest Colorado, where we really see some more major shifts in the snow and precipitation patterns compared to all the basins we've seen so far. Currently sitting at 80% of normal snowpack. And you can see that all of southern Colorado really did not get as much benefit from April precipitation as northern Colorado. I'd have to review Peter's presentation to look at exactly what the temperatures are, but you can see here's this late March kind of peak and start to melt out, but just some little blips of increases, whereas basins in northern Colorado have really maintained that near that peak value for a longer period of time. So already well into the melt season in the San Juan Mountains. Water year to date precipitation, not terrible, currently 92% of median. But again, depending on what your vested interest is in water, we are anticipating an earlier than normal stream melt or stream flow runoff peak, generally an earlier than normal pulse of water coming through those systems. Looking at reservoir storage, I believe it is second lowest. I want to say these combined basins currently have about 65% of average or of normal reservoir storage. I think the Gunnison was maybe at 63%. We do see Trout Lake down near Telluride at about 150% of average, but not a large body of water by any means. Other notable ones, Lemon and Vallecito reservoirs, McPhee Reservoir on the Dolores is currently very, very low after several years of really low runoff. So not anticipating very much water running downstream out of the Dolores there. Moving on into our volumetric streamflow forecasts. Here, related to what I was just mentioning, the Dolores at Dolores, just upstream, is forecast for, looks like a little above 70% of normal values. So not an extravagant amount of inflow going into McPhee there to replenish it. Again, here's a forecast for McPhee, just a couple miles downstream, really pretty similar. And look at the exact number. Why am I not seeing? We'll just bump down to the map, excuse me. But as the chart showed, all these forecasts in the combined San Miguel, Dolores, Animas, and San Juan are relatively closely clustered, generally from around 70%, a little bit lower there, up to the low 80s. What I was looking for a minute ago here, the Animas at Durango is forecast for 74%. Obviously, one of the more major stream flow points. Moving over to the east into the Rio Grande Basin, very, very similar pattern of snow accumulation and subsequent melt. Currently, 80% of normal. One thing to take note of here is how steep this melt curve has been just over the last, I'm not sure exactly what that is, week or so, relative to a normal snowpack melt out rate. So not only substantially earlier than normal, but also given more more warm weather, we can anticipate that to continue. And also following up on Peter's comments with the interconnectedness of temperature and wind, warm weather and windy conditions can also combine to increase snow melt rate pretty substantially. Just basically right over the very surface of the snow, you can have much cooler temperatures right there, but the more the wind increases, the more you get that warm air with very low humidity going over that snow surface, and that can also increase melt rates. Looking at our water year-to-date precipitation, currently 87% of normal. Not as many dramatic swings as we saw in many parts of the state. Again, this increase or this input of precipitation as snow near the end of last year wasn't quite as big as many other areas of the state. Pretty slow and steady increases in the Rio Grande. Looking at reservoirs, kind of across the board with respect to normal. I won't dive in too much, but again, happy to provide some more resources for anyone who wants to dig in and deeper. Looking at our streamflow forecasts, pretty uniformly looking at for below normal values here. Most of these points do just have their 70%, or excuse me, we present these in different ways. But yeah, basically very unlikely given the climatic outlook that we're going to get enough precipitation over the next couple months to achieve average stream flow conditions in the Rio Grande. But we can certainly all do our rain and snow dances and hope for it. Some of the things here I'll point out. One of the most major points in the Rio Grande for Colorado is the Rio Grande near Del Norte here, which is a big decider in how are compact with the lower Rio Grande basins, with how much water is required to send down to New Mexico. So here you can see the Rio Grande near Del Norte is probably in that 70 to 80% of normal range. And I'll show it on the map here in a second, but really some of the most meager streamflow forecasts in the entire state are coming out of the southern Sangre de Cristos here. Kind of, I'm not sure what this highway is, but basically south of Alamosa here, all of these smaller streams coming out of the southern Sangres are near and below 50% of normal values. whereas some emanating from more the eastern San Juans are quite plentiful, or quite a bit more plentiful. I should correct that. Going over to our final major basin here in the Arkansas, kind of in the middle of the road as far as the snowpack accumulation and melt pattern that we've seen across the state. Did achieve its seasonal peak very near the normal time of year, and over the last couple weeks has started to melt out with kind of one increase out of that last storm. Again, pretty steep melt curve, similar to what we did see in the Rio Grande. So could anticipate that to continue at this point, especially given warm weathers, or if precipitation starts to fall on the snowpack as rain and things like that. We can anticipate an earlier than normal stream flow response in many parts of the Arkansas. Precipitation, currently 92% of normal water year precipitation, also similar to the Rio Grande, and even more exaggerated, of probably the most slow and steady increase in precipitation throughout the water year so far. Reservoir conditions also kind of in the middle of the pack with respect to the state. Yeah, not quite as variable as some basins, but generally ranging from about 60% of average to a little less than 110% of reservoir volume. Looking at our stream flow forecasts, again, we'll see this in the map in a second, but the main stem Arkansas headwaters are faring some of the best. Here we've got the Arkansas at Salida, forecast to be just below normal values. So if more wet weather does come through, that could bump up that stream flow runoff to above normal. Even similarly, further downstream at Pueblo, slightly lower, but not terrible forecasts there as well. Looking at the map here, kind of see we've got our highest in the whole basin is Chalk Creek at Nathrop here. A pretty decent contributor to the main stem. Here we've got Salida on down to Pueblo, and then slightly better forecasts coming off the east side of the southern Sangre de Cristo Mountains here. But again, this kind of area in the southern Sangres by a considerable bit has our lowest stream flow forecast. So little wrap up of what we're seeing across the state. I mean, per usual in Colorado, being a headwaters state, it is really critical to pay attention to your basin of interest because things can vary quite widely spatially. But currently statewide snowpack is 91% of normal. And you can again see this peak here at the end of March. And that will quite likely be our total seasonal peak, but intermittent cold weather and increases in precipitation and snowpack have kind of maintained pretty similar levels, really not seeing that net decline in the big picture that we've seen in the basins of southern Colorado. Here you can see it spatially with central and northern Colorado right near normal values, slightly lower furthest in the north, but generally near normal, and then our lowest snowpack values here in southern Colorado. And again, this is driven largely by an earlier melt cycle as opposed to necessarily where the peak went, but that can vary place to place. Statewide water year-to-date precipitation at our mountain snowtel sites, currently 95% of normal. So here's the map of our water year precipitation. Especially compared to years in recent past, not enormous amounts of variation necessarily, ranging from a low of 87% here in the Rio Grande, just up to a high of 101% in the Gunnison and the combined Laramie and North Platte basins. So despite the kind of temporal and spatial variabilities throughout the year, water year precipitation relatively consistent statewide. So here we are looking at month to date, where we really see those big differences. You know, very, very minimal precipitation here in the Gunnison and our combined Southwest basins, really, as well as the Rio Grande and Arkansas. So in addition to just the cooler weather that minimal increases to the snowpack has allowed those basins to start melting out earlier. So what we've been seeing the last 3 weeks is really important, looking at our hydrology going forward. Here we are looking at reservoir storage on the map. As mentioned, the lowest in the state is in the Gunnison, largely driven by Blue Mesa. Our combined Southwest basins are in that range, with generally all of the greater Colorado holding the lowest reservoirs, including the main stem headwaters, Yampa, White Little Snake. And as I've mentioned, I think a couple times, the South Platte currently is the only major basin with above normal reservoir storages. So this is an interesting graph. I'll kind of walk you through it. There's kind of a lot going on at a graph, at a glance, but this is basically going back to the early 1990s. Looking at our volumetric departure from normal values. So you can kind of see how we've compared to the other major droughts. Here you can see 2002, 2012, around 2018 here, and here we are currently. So this purple line is basically the deviation from normal of all our combined reservoir storages in the state. So you can see it is in range with some of our lowest storages going back more than 30 years now. Then looking at individual basins, this gray trace here is our combined Southwest basins. So over the last couple years here, going back to December 2019, basically, those Southwest basins have just consistently dropped a ton of volume, followed by the Gunnison here in blue and the Colorado headwaters in this slightly darker blue, purplish blue color. Whereas all the other basins in the state have maintained fairly steady. It is really those, the Colorado headwaters and our basins of Southwest Colorado that are driving a lot of these numbers down. Streamflow forecasts, largely following patterns that we see in snowpack and precipitation. Again, here Gunnison and the Laramie and North Platte have the most plentiful snowpacks in the state, some of the better streamflow forecasts as well. But I really can't reiterate enough that keeping an eye on how reservoir storage integrates into this big picture is very important this year, depending on what part of the state you have interest. So I threw this graph in here. I believe Joel showed some of these last year. This is our SNOTEL soil moisture. Looking at the statewide average, definitely varies quite a bit basin to basin. And also please note, this is, we do consider this provisional data. Currently, a lot of this soil moisture is raw data that does have quite a few outliers in it that we haven't had time to go clean up. But really what I wanted to show here is this black line is our current year, again, statewide. And I chose to show this because it utilizes the most sites to give kind of a big picture. So black line is this year, green line is the median value. So really important here going into winter, you can see how dry the soils were statewide and kind of maintaining through winter. And then here in late March, when we saw that first big pulse of snowmelt, we saw a big increase in soil moisture, leaving it closer to normal values. And there's a lot of work to be done to continue deciphering this into effective forecasting, but very important to note, for a third year in a row, we did enter winter with lower than normal soil moisture conditions statewide, which can have a big effect on the resulting My last couple points here. This is from last month, the March 1st Surface Water Supply Index. Unfortunately, well below normal SWASIs, statewide, kind of the worst down here in the Dolores. Really the only SWASI above 1 is in the Laramie Basin, exiting immediately to Wyoming. This is the April 1st, very, very similar, slight increase in the Dolores here. It changed colors, but big picture, the values are fairly similar. And this is combining a variety of components and can be a good glance at not only what our snowpack and forecasts are, but it also rolls in reservoir storage. So you can see as an example here in the Gunnison, a very low surface water supply index for this sub-basin that includes Blue Mesa Reservoir. So despite having a good snowpack and pretty decent streamflow forecasts, those really low reservoir storages are bringing down the surface water supply. So kind of just a wrap up here. Again, statewide snowpack peaked a bit earlier than normal, around 94% of our normal value, but really important also to note that very spatially with our southern basins already starting to melt out, whereas some of our northern basins could possibly even achieve another peak, but have more or less maintained similar values over the last 3 weeks or so. Again, all basins, even at high elevation sites, have observed net snow melt. So important to note that we call that the snow melt as being ripe or isothermal. Basically, it is allowing liquid water to flow all the way through into the soil structure. So any more warm weather, warm wind, rain on snow, it is ready to melt and start contributing to stream flows. April's precipitation, really dramatic differences, favoring definitely central Colorado and northern Colorado, and minimal increases to the mountain snowpack in southern Colorado over the last 3 weeks. Reservoir storage is one of the biggest things I've really been trying to communicate. Again, very, very low in southwest Colorado, better in the northern Front Range. But what we really saw is not only for local water users, but with the mandated drawdown of upper basin reservoirs to buffer Lake Powell to maintain that power production is a stark reminder of how interconnected we are here in Colorado with not only the Colorado Basin, but that could affect our other headwaters state. But not only on Blue Mesa, but the long-term picture on Lake Mead and Lake Powell, which are both extremely low, is going to affect us here, even being upstream for years to come. Again, went into winter with a soil moisture deficit, which is why we're seeing across the board our streamflow forecast percent of normal being less than what we're observing for peak snowpacks. Again, those dry soil conditions have to absorb a certain amount of water before releasing it into our stream systems. And generally, again, unfortunately, below normal streamflow forecasts across the state. Certainly some sites are above, but in general, below normal, but try and focus on a bit of positive here. Definitely a substantially better outlook than what was observed last year. And that is all I have for now. And I am happy to take any questions if anyone has any.
Great. Thanks so much, Carl. I appreciate there's some questions and answers going on in the chat. I really appreciate that. We're running a little behind our agenda. So if you could keep your questions to the chat, that would be great. This month, we have the flood outlook. Last month we did the wildfire. Normally those are switched, but so we do have an extra presentation this month to get through still. So with that, I'm going to hand the mic over to Kevin Hauk. Oh, Ryan. Oh, no, sorry. I thought I saw somebody's hand was raised, but that was just my cursor. I'm going to hand it over to Kevin Hauk in CWCB who will introduce the next presenter.
Great, thank you, Megan. It's exciting to be on here, and as Megan mentioned, normally we provide this presentation in our March board meeting when we have a little bit more of a flood focus, which we thought probably wasn't necessary this year since it doesn't look like the outlook for spring flooding is even going to be approaching normal, although of course it can happen anytime, any year, depending on certain day-to-day conditions. But I would like to introduce, or in this case, reintroduce Dewberry Consultants as our selected engineer and consultant for our flood threat bulletin, which is something that we have implemented every year for the past 15 years during the flood season. We go from May 1st through September 30th, and what it does is it provides a daily assessment of the risks for mostly rainfall-based flooding for that particular day throughout the state. There are a couple other features that are also involved that Dewberry will discuss in their presentation, I assume. We provide a summary of the precipitation that fell the previous day, as well as twice a week we do a multi-day outlook so that we can look ahead towards future conditions and view the flood risks looking forward. We decided to implement a few changes, or I should say upgrades this year with the new selection. And I think Dewberry is going to talk quite a bit about that during the presentation, but you'll see that we're really focusing our improvements on wildfire burn scars and the impacts to debris flows and flooding that we all know we can experience for many years into the future. That has been a big part of our floods that we have observed over the last 5 to 8 years. And I expect that will either continue or even increase with the increasing impacts of wildfire to our state. So we are rushing to get a contract in place, but I will say again that the forecasting season starts on May 1st. So that should be coming up here in just a couple weeks. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Dewberry to discuss the program and some of the improvements that we are looking at implementing this year. So go ahead, Dewberry.
Hey, thanks, Kevin. It's been great being on the call so far. Appreciate all of the information on kind of where we stand this season. So myself, the project manager for this project with Kevin and CWCB. We have our team on the line as well. Alyssa Hendricks-Dietrich is our lead meteorologist at Dewberry, and we've got a bigger team for this contract cycle for the flood threat bulletin, including Hydromet Consulting. They'll be leading out on our forecast operations for the FTB. And I believe that Dana McGlone and Dima Smirnoff are still listening in. So if questions come up, they'll be available as well. Alyssa's going to run through kind of summarizing in a little more detail what Kevin teed up for us. But again, I just wanted to kind of reintroduce the website. It's still up right now and never really goes down. However, as Kevin mentioned, our operations will begin on May 1st. And our primary objective here is really to increase the lead time during this flood season, for heavy rainfall, and how that heavy rainfall could contribute to flooding across the state, broken out into the kind of the various geographic topography areas as identified for the 14 forecast zones that we are looking at in detail. So I'll turn it over to Alyssa now to jump in through these. I know we're kind of running a little bit behind, so at least wanted to do a bit to kind of reintroduce everyone to what we'll be doing this season. So thanks so much, and thanks, Alyssa.
Thanks. So I'll just go through quickly some of the main products that are available on that Colorado Flood Threat Bulletin website, first of which is the actual Flood Threat Bulletin, or FTB. It's issued at 11 a.m. daily and is, like David had mentioned, identifies areas of flood risk for the next 24 hours. There are 5 threat categories that are then given to each county based on their expected probability of flooding, going from no flood threat to all the way to high impact, where greater than 60% of the county is in a particularly severe or threatening situation. There's also the possibility for evening updates on those particularly high impact days, but generally that product is released daily by 11 a.m. Then second is the state precipitation map, or SPM, and this is a look back at the past 24 to 72 hours of hydrometeorological conditions across the entire state. In years past, this was issued at 11 a.m., but going forward, we're going to make sure that's issued by noon daily to just give that much more time for any delayed flood reports that may come in. Within this, there's also kind of a blog style report that gives any rainfall totals, mention of flooding, local storm reports, or antecedent soil moisture conditions. The third product is the Flood Threat Outlook, or FTO, which is issued twice weekly on Mondays and Thursdays by 3 p.m. And this overall is an outlook of the threat and precipitation totals over a 15-day period. It involves or includes discussions of rapid snowmelt, local heavy rainfall, drought development. It also tracks riverine flooding from warm-ups or rain over high flows. And then lastly, we have the Fire Burn Forecast, or FPF. This is issued also at 11 a.m. daily, and for the first time in the 2021 season, so last season, we had a standalone forecast webpage for that. This map on the right here shows those fire burn areas that were used in the 2021 season, with some proposed new additions for the upcoming season, which I will talk about that in a few more slides. One other, not quite product, but one thing we wanted to highlight tool that's available is the Report a Flood tool. This is so anyone in the public can report flooding that they observe. On our webpage, there's a page to fill in date, time, location, and then types of hazards and any additional information, as well as your contact information if we have any follow-up questions. So we had a few report of floods from the public in the 2021 season, but we definitely would like to highlight this tool, make sure you know, everyone who's capable and can safely make a flood report is able to do so. They're really helpful for us in disseminating that information through our products. And then, like I had mentioned, one of the main improvements of the 2021 season was the dedicated wildfire burn area page, or the fire burn forecast, where we monitored daily threats on 6 large burns, several of which were large burns from the 2020 season. This page includes a table with multiple variables describing the antecedent conditions over each of the burn areas, including the percentage of a burn area that received excessive rainfall, and any assessment of whether flooding did occur in the past 24 hours. These come from local storm reports, not necessarily precipitation gauges, but if someone, you know, makes a report that indicates there was flooding over a burn area. Similar to all of our products, the are archived daily in a blog style for better awareness during multi-day events. And then actually at the end of the season, we can use all of these daily tables as kind of a database for assessing statistics over the burn areas. Like I had mentioned, so the 2021 season, we were most concerned about the Cameron Peak, East Troublesome, Calwood, Grizzly Peak, and Pine Gulch fires, most of which were very large fires from the very active 2020 season. But we did keep an eye on some other burn areas at that point. There are also thresholds associated with each of these fire burn areas that are reassessed every season based on changes over, you know, the years, as each burn area has now had a full year in flood season to kind of recover. Then looking forward to this upcoming season, we do have some more improvements planned. First, we'll be adding 5 new burn areas to that fire burn forecast. The Decker, Middle Fork, Morgan Creek, Sylvan, and Williams Fork burn areas were ones we particularly noticed in the 2021 season that still needed or still could benefit from additional fire burn forecasts. And then we'll also include those forecasts in a summary in the main flood threat bulletin headline. So you can see an example of what that fire burn forecast summary will look like in an FTB headline. Additionally, Hydromet Consultants, who we're partnering with for this, is going to provide their forecast maps available to the public for a GIS download. It won't be available just directly on the page. We'll need to reach out for that to go through kind of an understanding process to make sure those products are being used correctly. But those those maps will be able for general public download. We're also utilizing the updated MetStorm Live quantitative precipitation estimates out of DTN. These will provide us options for more flexible intraday durations of QPE, and it'll be on an interactive zoomable web map on the web page. And then the flood threat outflow or flood threat outlook is going to also start Streamflow tracking. So once a month, they'll provide adjusted streamflow at these 13 major river locations seen in this map on the bottom right. These sites in particular averaged at least 200,000 acre feet of flow during the April through September period, coming from the NRCS, and accounts for most of the non-natural diversions and dams to provide an estimate of natural stream flow across the state. Not quite ready for the 2022 season, but proposed program improvements over the next 5-year contract period. Major overhauls of the state precipitation map, which will include integrating USGS real-time gauges, social media reports, and National Weather Service local storm reports on that interactive map, so end users can get that relevant information quickly in a customizable, viewable data. And then also adding hazard mapping to our fire burn areas with USGS debris flow models. We can overlay potential hazards at things like trails, campgrounds, and any of the roads within those particular fire burn areas. Also, this will be available in an interactive map for end users. And then another main large improvement, in order to house most of these improvements, we're going to totally redesign the web page to a React application that will accommodate the hosting and access of all these upgrades. It'll allow for us to provide those flood threat polygons and QPE grids more easily to the public, have our daily forecasts archived in an easier format to get to a given date. All of this with the main goal to make all of this information easier to get to our end users. And then just a few more things for outreach. We will be providing a training webinar for this upcoming season, sometime before the pre-monsoon season, mid to late June. So keep an eye out for information on that. And then we also post the Colorado Flood Threat Bulletin updates daily to Facebook and Twitter, using both the handle at CO Flood Updates for Facebook and Twitter. So here's an example of a tweet from the last few, or from the 2021 season, indicating the broad reach that these tweets have, create. We also use the hashtags CO Flood, COWX, CO Weather, and CO Fire. If you have any more questions, happy to answer them, but we could also put up here some of our information. So again, the forecasts and the flood threat bulletin are available every day on the coloradofloodthreat.com website. There you can also sign up for the daily email service. Be sure to follow on Twitter and Facebook at CO Flood Updates. And if you have any questions, you can refer them to David Sutley at Dewberry or the general Colorado Flood Threat gmail.com account. If you have any forecast questions in particular, Hydromet Consulting is who you'll want to reach out to there, and they can be reached at hydrometconsulting@gmail.com. So I see there might be a couple questions in the chat. Let me move that over. But nope, looks like they're just old updates I hadn't seen. So with that, happy to answer any questions. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Alyssa and David. So I don't know if anybody has any questions. Be happy to take them, but we're looking forward to starting this service back up on May 1st. And I encourage any of you who are affected by flood threats, regardless of where you are in the state, to start logging in at coloradofloodthreat.com. And I believe Dana, who is part of the team, just put in the chat about how to add yourself to the daily email listserv if that is something you are interested in. So with that.
Thanks for sharing that link, Dana.
Just going to say that, Kevin. So appreciate it. Yep. The more users, the better. We'll get the word out, and yeah, hopefully just get more folks involved in the program and the community that we are pushing forward. So thank you.
All right, Megan, I guess we can turn it back over to you then.
Oh, I did see, we just saw one question asking if the reports of flooding are available publicly somewhere in real time. In real time is tricky. A lot of them come in later, especially if there's, emergency responses. We get most of our flood reports from the National Weather Service, local storm reports. So they are held on their website, but in real time, they're usually delayed. I think that's the last question though.
Great. Thank you so much, guys. Really looking forward to following those the upgraded products this summer. Any other questions for any of our presenters? Otherwise, would love to move on. We do have a few minutes here for any updates from our water providers. And I know Megan Holcomb knew you all a little bit better, and she would call some of you out. Unfortunately, as I'm just getting to know you, I don't have that same opportunity. So if you wouldn't mind just volunteering, introducing yourself and where you represent, and sharing your updates with us, I'd really appreciate it. Anybody willing to, any water providers willing to?
This is Swithin. I'll go ahead and break the ice.
Thank you so much, Swithin. I really appreciate it.
Was wishing we still had ice around, but that's not the case anymore. I work for Centennial. We serve Highlands Ranch. We are a combined surface water and groundwater system. Our reservoir storage right now is about 44%. That's probably down from normal by about a quarter of what we normally have. So 3/4 full compared to where we usually are. I've been doing this for a couple decades, and my gut meter is moving from cautious to concern as we go into April with not receiving any moisture, and we're looking at 80-degree temps today. Luckily, our demands have not really come in strong like they have the past few years. We had more of what I consider a normal March, but Snowpack and Streamflow Forecasts don't look that encouraging to me.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, especially the Swithin gut meter. That might be a product we need to look at implementing. Anybody else? Jordan, looks like you came off mute. Can I put you
Yep,
on
I
the
can jump
spot?
in next.
Thanks.
I'm Jordan Soldano from Denver Water. Just a couple of updates from us. Denver Water Reservoir Storage is currently at 79% full, which is right about at our historical median. And then as far as South Platte Snowpack, we're at 74% of normal. And for our Colorado River Basin Snowpack, we're looking at 88% of normal. So far for demands this month, April is averaging about 109 MGD.
Great. Thanks, Jordan. Any other water providers?
Hi, this is John Orr from City of Thornton.
Thanks, John.
Storage right now is at about 73.3%, which is, normal because we draw down over the winter. We're expecting to fill, and so that's good news. Stanley Lake is at 79.9% right now, and the partners in the lake are expecting to fill this year. Although if the weather stays warm, as Swithin says, who knows? excuse me, our demand is up a half a percent over 2021. And so, you know, which reflects the warm weather and the outside landscaping is starting up in Thornton. We don't anticipate any drought restrictions at this time because we do expect to fill, and that's our big trigger. That's my report.
Thank you so much. That is really helpful information. I'm taking notes as well as we go through here. So appreciate your patience, everyone. Anyone else, any other providers online care to share how things are going?
I'm not a provider, but I'll provide a report. Scott Hummer, Water Commissioner, Yampa River Headwaters.
Thanks so much, Scott.
Flows at the gauge at Steamboat, Maybell, and Deer Lodge are all running below the 25th percentile this morning. Flow at Steamboat this morning is 264 CFS. A year ago today, it was 139 CFS. Which was the historic minimum for the life of the gauge. The median flow for today should be 597 CFS. At Maybell, last year it was 597. Today it's 1140. The median is 2610. Again, less than the 25th percentile. At Deer Lodge, which would include the Little Snake, a year ago today, 936. Today, 1390. Less than a 25th percentile. The median is 3620. The local Cocoa Raz site in South Routt County on the 5 Pine Mesa at approximately 8,500 feet. Got a report from a former water commissioner who cares for that site. That site melted out this morning. It melted out last year, a week ago. On the 4th. Today it melted out, excuse me. Melted out on the 12th of April last year, melted out the 19th of April this year. It's not, I'm not optimistic.
Okay. Thank you, Scott, so much. These local observations from around the state are extremely helpful to us. So we really, really appreciate you sharing. Anybody else, especially from parts of the state we haven't heard from yet? If anybody else would volunteer to share what their gut meters.
I wonder if Joel Sneakloff might have an update for us. Joel, are you able to give us an update?
Yeah, I'm here. At least it's not blowing today. This has been one of the most peculiar springs I've seen. The old timers saying, I've never seen it blow like this for this many days. And the amount of dirt that has moved in the Eastern Plains. I can honestly say in 20 some years living here, I've never seen this many roads closed because of blowing dirt conditions and lack of visibility. Oh, I need to shut my window because the train's coming. And he'll blow his horn right outside my window. Moisture-wise, we're extremely poor conditions for anything that was a summer crop last year. Talking to the wheat breeder and some of the other people that are touring the state around early for the wheat, they're saying this is some of the worst looking wheat they've seen this year. There's only a couple spots around the state, and they're very small. And typically in the northeast corner, that the wheat actually looks somewhat decent. The rest of it looks pathetic, and they're already abandoning sites that they had for variety trials, as well as a couple breeding programs. because the wheat just did not come up. We're seeing some wheat come up. I was planted last fall, but less than 50% is up, most of it. Some of that has been blown, so we've lost that as well. Peter commented about talking about the wind and the evaporation losses. Well, if you don't have moisture in the soil, you don't have evaporation. So it doesn't matter how much it blows, there's no water to evaporate. It's been interesting how fast it has evaporated in some areas. We had water where we were planting plot, tried to plant plots a week ago Monday, and it was too tacky. 3 days later, we were barely getting in the moisture, down 1.5 inches. So South Platte River, by the looks of it, should be okay with what was shown by predicted stream flows and what I've seen for storage in the South Platte. The only new thing happening within the state is the Nebraska threatening lawsuit. So we'll see where that goes.
All right, thank you so much, Joel. And Joel, can you remind me where you are based out of? Sounds like Northeast.
But based out of Akron, but I cover all the South Platte and Republican basins.
Okay, thank you so much. Anyone else? Anybody from the Southwest area?
Hi, I'm Beverly Richards. I'm not from the Southwest, but I'm from the Gunnison area.
Oh yeah, great.
And you know, you saw the conditions that Carl talked about in the Upper Gunnison Basin and the entire Gunnison Basin for that matter. Reservoir, you know, Blue Mesa is at 29% full, and it's not expected to fill this year. And the predictions are that by the end of this year, it'll be right back to the same amount. It is not really warm, but it has been very windy here, so soils are really dry. And it looks to me like maybe we've had a little bit of snow melt going on in the past day or so. One of the gauges that we monitor regularly was yesterday it was 350 CFS, today it's 516 CFS, which is about 2 weeks early. So things are not looking real good for this area either. Hopefully we get some more precipitation.
Yeah, that's good to hear. Definitely some big impacts there. Thanks for sharing, Beverly. I appreciate it.
Sure.
Any final shares? All right, not hearing any. I appreciate it. There's been some chatter going on in the chat. Thanks for responding to that. And please feel free to throw any last minute questions in there. I will let you know the May Water Availability Task Force meeting has been pushed back to May 19th. Just wanted to flag that it was previously scheduled for May 17th. So again, that will now happen on May 19th. We'll send around updated invites and update the website accordingly, but just wanted to flag that for everyone. And with that, we'll give you 5 minutes back in your day. Thank you everyone for some really insightful presentations. Wish it was better news, but just really interesting to hear what's going on all around the state. Thank you all for your patience with me, and great to see all of you and see some of you that I know and haven't seen in a while. So thanks everyone.
Thanks, Megan.
Enjoy the rest of your days.
Thank you.